The dull ache in my lower back had become an uninvited companion after the 6th hour of my shift. Every step across the polished marble floors of Vincenzo's sent a ripple of pain through muscles that had long forgotten what rest felt like. The scent of fresh basil and slow-simmered tomato sauce clung to my uniform like a second skin, blending with the splash of expensive red wine that had landed on my apron during the dinner rush. I balanced 3 steaming plates of risotto in my left hand, weaving through tables where men wore suits that cost more than 3 months of my rent, and women draped themselves in the cool gleam of diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers above. Vincenzo's was not a place meant for people like me, at least not as diners. Sitting on the corner of Arthur Avenue in the heart of the Bronx, the restaurant, steeped in old Italian charm, had survived through 3 generations under the Moretti family. It remained an unwritten sanctuary for long-rooted Italian families, those once pillars of closed circles whose names never graced the newspapers, but whose words could silence an entire street with a single nod. The walls were covered in black and white photographs of old Napoli, fishing boats, sun-drenched coastlines, images my grandmother, Maria Russo, used to describe every night as she lulled me to sleep. I grew up with those stories, with the thick Napoli accent, with the aroma of ragu simmered every Sunday morning. Now I served ragu to strangers, people who never looked at my face, only at the plates I set down. Emily, table 12 needs the check. The private room wants another bottle of Barolo. Marco's voice, the evening manager, landed just beside my ear, a constant reminder of how invisible I was in this world. Short, balding, always glistening with a sheen of sweat, he survived by inhaling other people's tension. And listen, we've got a new guy tonight. Antonio called out last minute, so the staffing agency sent someone over. Keep an eye on him. Don't let him ruin dinner service. I nodded, set down the risotto at table 7 with a smile sharpened by 53 straight weeks without a day off, then glanced toward the service station where the new employee stood. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cut dark hair, and he carried himself less like a server and more like someone who had just stepped off a military training ground. His hands fumbled with the wine key, his rough fingers ill-suited for work requiring finesse. Something about the way he stood made the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a discomfort I had learned to trust after years living in neighborhoods where survival instincts were a requirement, not a choice. The room hummed with a blend of Italian and English layered over the clink of glasses and hazy opera drifting from speakers hidden in the ceiling. I moved like a shadow, pouring water, clearing plates, anticipating needs before they were voiced. That was the skill I had honed during my 3 years at Vincenzo's, to be present without ever truly being seen. Nonna Maria would have been proud of my dexterity, or perhaps saddened by whatever had led me here. The Russo family had once been something in Napoli before the war scattered us across the ocean. She told stories of villas and olive groves, of agreements sealed across generations and debts of honor worth more than money. I had always assumed those were fairy tales, crafted to make poverty sound poetic. But sometimes, serving guests with ancient names and even older money, I caught a flicker in their eyes, a moment where they weren't looking at me, but through me, seeing another face layered over mine from some distant memory. And tonight, the private room had been reserved by a group whispered about with cautious reverence. Marco called it Duca's table, with a mix of respect and unhidden fear. Nico Moretti, head of the Moretti family, was not a name seen in headlines or a face shown at press conferences. He existed in the shadows, his influence measured by the silence that followed him into a room, not by the noise he made. I had never served him. That privilege belonged to the seasoned staff. But I had seen him from afar and recognized the way powerful men bent slightly in his presence, how the air seemed to tilt when he entered. And now, something in the atmosphere shifted, a sense that something was about to happen. If you're still listening, and something in this story has touched a quiet place inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Like and share this video so we can keep bringing you heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, would you tell me where you're watching from? Leave a comment below. Let me know where in the world this story has reached. We cherish every word you share with us. The new guy still stood at the service station, fumbling with the clean glasses as if he had never carried a tray in his life. I glanced at him without fully turning. Just a flick of my eyes reflected off the stainless steel surface of the glass cabinet. He held the wine glass like someone who had never tasted wine, much less served it. His thumb pressed too hard on the stem, making the delicate glass squeal as it brushed against the others. His tie was knotted too tightly, his shirt stiff as though fresh from dry cleaning, untouched by the wrinkles that real servers collected within hours of running the floor. And something in his eyes, each time they shifted toward the hallway leading to the private room, rooted my gaze to him. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't awe at seeing powerful clients. It was calculation, the gaze of a hunter mapping the path to his prey. I pretended not to notice, but the Bronx had taught me to read bodies before words. And his body spoke a language that didn't belong anywhere near hospitality work. I kept moving, pausing at table 16 to offer dessert, refilling wine at table 13, though my focus never left the service station. The new man suddenly slid a hand into the inner pocket of his jacket. Nothing strange except that in the brief lift of his shirt, a sliver of gray metal flashed beneath his left elbow, tucked under the sleeve. I didn't need another look. I had seen that before. A forearm-strapped dagger meant for close range, quick draw. Boys. I used to know boys who disappeared into the dark and returned with long scars and eyes like winter had carried weapons like that under their winter coats. I knew the walk of someone armed. And he was armed. I slowed, stooping to pick up a fallen napkin near the bar to buy myself time. Across the dining room, Marco stood near the register, eyes darting around the tables. If I told him what I'd seen, he would doubt me first, then investigate, then delay. And with a man like Nico Moretti, a few seconds could decide life or death. I looked again at the stranger and realized he had stopped pretending to work. Leaving the glasses behind, he pulled a napkin from his pocket, wiped his hands, and began walking toward the hallway to the private room. I swallowed hard, icy fear sliding from my neck down my spine. My hands trembled slightly as I poured the last glass of wine. My mind raced through instinct and terror. The police would never arrive in time. Marco wouldn't believe me. But I had seen that look, that blade, that movement, the precise, measured stride of someone closing in on a target. I looked down at my hand, slick with cold sweat. I jammed my palm against my apron, wiping it dry in one fierce motion, then snatched the pen from my pocket. In a few frantic heartbeats, I pressed the tip hard into my skin, the ballpoint digging deep to make the ink flow. Beneath the sparkle of the chandelier and the soft swell of opera, I knew everything would shatter if I didn't act. The letters were jagged and hurried, but the 4 words remained clear. He is an imposter. Run. I had no time left for second thoughts or regret. Only the pounding of my heart, the weight of my steps, and my eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door of the private room where Nico Moretti sat among the most powerful men in the Bronx, unaware that death was walking toward him, just one hallway away. I moved as if my body already knew what it needed to do long before my mind could catch up. The stranger's footsteps echoed softly across the stone floor, steady and sure, carrying none of the clumsy uncertainty of a new hire. He walked straight toward the hallway to the private room with the focus of someone who had measured each step long before he ever arrived. I held a tray of water in my right hand, pressing my left palm close to my body so no one would see the shaky handwriting I'd just scrawled. The ink was still damp, bleeding into the lines of my skin, making my hand feel cold as though it, too, understood the gravity of what was unfolding. If anyone called my name now, if any customer asked for another plate or a sprinkle more parmesan, I would lose my chance. And if I lost my chance, the man in that room might lose his life. I quickened my pace when the stranger neared the hallway, his shoulders tightening slightly, his left arm shifting inward beneath his jacket, the unmistakable gesture of someone checking the position of a weapon. He wasn't looking around anymore. His target lay ahead, only a few steps away. The whole room seemed to shrink, the clinking of glasses fading, the hum of conversation and soft opera dissolving into a distant blur. There was only the stranger and the heavy wooden door leading to the room where the most powerful men in the Bronx were dining under warm golden light. And Nico Moretti, completely unaware that death hovered just behind him. I leaned forward, slipping past 2 tables, shaping myself into the image of a busy server delivering water to the private room. My heartbeat thundered so loudly I feared the nearest customer could hear it, feared the entire world could sense the line I was about to cross, something someone like me had never been meant to do. The moment the stranger placed his hand on the doorknob, I was only a few steps behind him. I couldn't afford to be slower. I sped up, nearly bumping his shoulder, releasing an apologetic word in Italian, an old phrase my grandmother had taught me to use whenever I needed to avoid trouble. He stepped back half a pace, irritated, but in that sliver of a moment I gained the space I needed. I lifted my right hand with the tray, my left hand angled toward the door as if I were about to knock to announce a new beverage being brought in. My palm, the messy warning written across it, caught the light. But it wasn't meant for the stranger. It was meant for the person behind the door. I nudged the door open with my elbow, sliding into the room with the false confidence of a seasoned server accustomed to tending to the most important guests. And in the instant the door swung wide, I saw Nico Moretti clearly for the very first time, not from a distance, not through rumor. He sat at the head of the table, white shirt, collar slightly open, the silver of his watch reflecting the warm glow around him. His face was sharply cut, the strong lines of a man who had lived his life in the shadows yet carried a terrifying calm. His eyes lifted when he saw me. I didn't say a word. No one in the room said a word. I simply raised the bottle of water to pour, shifting just enough that only he could see my palm. He is an imposter. Run. Nico's gaze dropped for half a second, long enough to read. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. I had never seen anyone receive a warning about his own possible death with such absolute stillness. When he lifted his eyes again, he looked at me a moment longer than necessary, a look that sent a cold shiver down my spine but carried something else too, something I couldn't quite name. As though, in a brief, unmeasurable instant, he saw me in a way even I didn't fully understand. Then he set his napkin down, rose slowly, and spoke a quiet phrase in Italian, his low voice halting the entire room. The men around him stood immediately. That was Nico's power. No noise, no threat. Just a single sentence that set an entire room in motion like a perfectly tuned machine. I finished pouring the water, my hands no longer trembling. I had done what I needed to do. As Nico stepped toward the side door, the door behind me burst open, and I heard the stranger's ragged breath, hurried footsteps, the crash of something hitting the floor. Maybe an argument, maybe a fight. I didn't look back. I simply left the room with my empty tray, exhaling like someone who had just gambled her own life without stopping to consider the consequences. Whatever happened next was no longer in my hands. But I knew one thing. From the moment I wrote on my palm, my life had veered onto a path I could never return from. I hadn't taken more than 10 seconds outside the private room when the sharp explosion of shattering glass sounded behind me, followed by the violent scrape of chairs, shoes sliding on stone, someone shouting frantic Italian I couldn't quite grasp. The noise erupted all at once, tearing apart the fragile veneer of calm the elegant room had tried to maintain. I didn't stop, didn't turn, only kept walking with the empty tray in hand, my face neutral, my heart hammering against my ribs. My whole body waited for a gunshot, that sharp final sound that would end everything, but it didn't come. Not yet. I saw Marco rushing through the hallway, pale as chalk, his eyes darting like a panicked animal searching for shelter. Another server yelled from the kitchen, asking what was happening, but no one answered. I set the tray down on the counter, my palms still slick with sweat. Had the stranger struck? Had he succeeded? I didn't know. I didn't dare know. Then suddenly the kitchen door flew open and two men in white shirts stumbled out, one dragging the other as though hauling him from a brawl. It was the stranger. His hair disheveled, his clothes twisted, and what froze me in place was the blood on his sleeve. Not much, but enough. A blow, a slash, or something worse. He didn't look at anyone, didn't search for anything. He just bolted toward the emergency exit behind the kitchen and disappeared into the night as if it had always been the plan. A server started to chase him, but Marco shouted, ordering everyone to stay put. No one moved. I stood rooted, unable to breathe, unable to feel anything clearly. But what stunned me more than anything was seeing Nico Moretti step out of the private room, his jacket gone, still holding a napkin as if he had simply finished a quiet, early evening meal, his expression free of any trace of someone who had just escaped death. He walked calmly, scanning the room as though assessing damage, then stopped when his gaze found me. In that brief second, every sound in the restaurant seemed to vanish. Nico's eyes met mine like a blade of cold steel. No anger, no gratitude, just one unmistakable thing. Acknowledgement shaped like caution. He didn't come closer, didn't speak. He only gave a slight nod, as if confirming to himself that what I had done was real, and that he had seen it. Then he turned away, signaling 3 men to follow. They left through the side door in absolute silence, no commotion, no theatrics, as though they had never been there at all. The other guests remained, tables still full, but no one truly understood what had just happened except those sensitive enough to sense that something catastrophic had been stopped by a thread. I stepped back behind the counter, sank into the small stool beside the wine rack, my hands gripping each other until my knuckles went white. Everything around me kept moving, but I knew that from the moment Nico saw my palm, our paths had crossed. Not by accident. I was no longer just a server. I had stepped into a world where I didn't belong, and if Nico truly believed my warning, it also meant the people trying to kill him would never let me go. I had no proof, no witnesses, no cameras catching what I wrote, no one to vouch for me. But I knew he read it, and he acted. In his world, life and death were decided in silence, and tonight, my silence had saved him. But I also knew that because of that, I would never again be invisible. I had been noticed. And from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. I ended my shift later than usual because Marco kept the entire staff back for an internal check. No one was reprimanded, no one was fired, but no one was allowed to leave until he said so. He didn't ask me anything, didn't mention the stranger, the private room, or any part of the strange chain of events that had just taken place. Everything was swept away like a sudden winter downpour, washing over us and disappearing, leaving only a cold, wet street behind and the uneasy glances everyone tried to hide. By the time I stepped out through the side door of Vincenzo's, night had settled completely. The October wind in the Bronx wrapped around me like a damp, cold cloth, seeping through the thin jacket I had worn since the beginning of my shift. I pulled the collar higher, tightened my grip on the strap of my bag, head lowered the way I always did, preparing to cut through the alley toward the avenue. But I didn't get far. At the mouth of the alley, a black car waited. Not an ordinary one. The headlights were dim, the body coated in a dark metallic sheen, the tires rolling silently over the pavement. The back door opened slowly, like a scene in a film, and he stepped out as though the night itself belonged to him. Nico Moretti was no longer wearing the tailored suit from earlier. Instead, he stood in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, the collar unbuttoned 3 times, revealing a thin silver chain and a small tattoo near his collarbone. Under the muted streetlight, he looked carved out of cold stone and hot blood, imperfect, but impossible to look away from. Emily Russo. He said my name as if it were a soft memory spoken aloud, a name he had repeated to himself before stepping out of the car. I stood frozen, cold from the inside out, unsure whether it was the wind or the deep echo of his voice filling the empty street. I didn't answer. I simply looked at him. His eyes were dark and deep, steady, carrying something beneath the surface I couldn't quite read. No anger, no fear, only the weighty presence of a man who always knew exactly where he was and why. "Thank you," he said quietly. No explanation, no ornament. He knew. I knew. And we both understood that what had happened could never be spoken aloud here. "I only did what I thought I had to do," I managed, my voice smaller than I expected. "Not everyone sees what you see," he replied, "and even fewer act on it. Especially when it has nothing to do with them." "It seems I'm involved now," I said with a faint laugh that wasn't really a laugh. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "I observe everyone who works at Vincenzo's," he said, as though explaining something utterly reasonable. "I know where they live, where they studied, who their families are, not because I distrust them, but because I cannot afford to be surprised." He paused. "You are Emily Russo, 27 years old, business management student at Lehman College, living alone in a small Tremont apartment, daughter of Anthony and Rosa Russo, killed in a car accident when you were 7, raised by your grandmother, Maria Russo." He stopped, no need to go further. I felt as if he had taken my life apart piece by piece, examined each part, then folded them back neatly. He already knew everything. I said nothing. I wasn't afraid. I simply felt exposed under the night sky. Nico reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an ivory-colored card, thick paper, embossed lettering, nothing on it except a single sequence of numbers. No name, no address, no logo. "If you need anything, call this number. Anytime." I looked at the card, then back at him. "Anything else?" I asked, unsure whether I wanted the conversation to continue or whether something unformed inside me was prompting the question. His gaze didn't leave mine. "Someone like you is never not involved. Not after tonight." His voice dipped lower. I held the card, the sharp edge cold against my skin like a boundary. When I lifted my head, he was already turning back to the car. The door shut with the same softness as his arrival. The car rolled away, dissolving into the dark. I stood alone in the Bronx wind and the dim amber glow of the streetlight. The card clenched in my hand like a key to a door I wasn't ready to open. But I knew it was open, and I couldn't go back. Nico's card stayed in a slot in my wallet for 3 days, a heavy little secret I carried everywhere. I told no one, spoke of nothing, tried to live as though everything had remained unchanged. But the Bronx never lets you stay untouched for long. On the 4th morning after the incident at Vincenzo's, I left early for class and noticed a black car parked across the street. only a few feet from my building. No front license plate, tinted windows, engine humming softly though the sun wasn't even up yet. I didn't think much, but my heart skipped a beat. By the time I returned that night, the car was gone. But the next day, a different one appeared. Different color, different man. Same position, same patient stillness, same cold watching. Then I realized I was being followed not only by cars. There were footsteps behind me on the walk from the subway some nights. A soft clatter at my window on nights that had never known such sounds. A sense that someone had stood inside my apartment while I was away, even though everything looked untouched to an untrained eye. And then came the detail that broke my denial. On Saturday morning, I found a thin scratch on my door lock. A fine mark, right on the rim. The kind left by a specialized tool interrupted. Perhaps, but attempted. I stood frozen with my key in hand, afraid to even turn it. I owned nothing valuable. I had no enemies. I was just a girl studying during the day, serving tables at night, living so quietly that even friends sometimes forgot I existed. But I had written a message on my palm, and the man I warned was Nico Moretti. I couldn't know for certain who had tried to break in, but I knew one thing. I was no longer safe. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, everything was in its place. No disarray, no obvious sign of intrusion. But the air smelled different. Something subtle, but unmistakable. Someone had stood here, breathing my air, watching my space. I collapsed onto the couch, hands shaking, phone beside me, but I had no idea who to call. The police? I had no proof. Friends? They would say I was paranoid. My grandmother? She would break down. No one in the world I knew could navigate this. And then, as though fate had been waiting for my fear to catch up, Nico's card slipped out of my wallet when I reached for my phone. Smooth ivory paper, raised numbers, 10 digits, and nothing more. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't want to be the one who called, but I had been the one who warned. I had stepped into their world, and now their shadows had stepped into mine. I pressed the call button before I could change my mind. 1 ring, 2 rings. No music, no automated greeting, just the hollow sound of a line ringing in silence. I was about to hang up when a voice I already knew reached me low, steady, velvet wrapped around steel. Emily. He said my name as if he had been expecting the call, as if it were the only logical next step. My throat tightened. I think someone was inside my apartment. He was silent for a moment, then asked, his voice even lower. Are there signs? I told him everything: the cars, the footsteps, the scratch on the lock, the strange air in the room. He didn't question, didn't doubt, didn't tell me to calm down. He only said one thing. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. I'm coming. And the line went dead. No goodbye. No request for my address. He already knew where I lived. I should have been afraid. But strangely, something else settled inside me. Hope. And the fear that hope might end up hurting me. The knock came exactly 11 minutes after I hung up. 3 short, decisive taps. Neither hurried nor hesitant. I had locked both layers of the door as he instructed the chain and the secondary bolt, and I was still standing in the center of the living room with a fruit knife in my hand, foolish and almost laughable compared to the world I was slowly being pulled into. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there, not hiding, not circling around the truth. The hallway's yellow light falling across a face that had already become familiar somewhere in my subconscious, though I had only seen it twice. I opened the door without asking. He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over the space so quickly I almost missed it. A small apartment, 2 rooms, old wooden floors, the faint scent of lavender oil lingering in the air. His gaze came to rest on the framed photograph beside the bookshelf, the black and white picture I had kept since childhood. My grandmother in her youth, beside a man in an old-style Italian suit, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his gaze full of quiet protection. Nico walked toward it, moving with a silence that felt almost reverent, as if he feared disrupting time itself. He lifted a hand and touched the wooden frame with the tip of his finger, tilting his head as though searching through his memory. "Your grandmother's name was Maria Russo." I nodded, unsure how he knew. "I met her once," he continued. "I was very young, and she didn't recognize me. My father brought me along on a special visit. She lived just a few blocks away then, in a house with grapevines in front. I still remember the smell of her baking." I stared at him, the edges of familiarity slowly filling in the empty spaces inside me. Nico turned back to me, his voice still even and low, but something more settled now in his gaze. "Your family and mine once had deep ties. In Napoli, before the war began, the Morettis and the Russos shared control over a portion of the harbor. They protected each other like two wings of the same body. Perhaps you were never told, but your grandmother was the keeper of the book." I frowned. "What book?" "The family ledger. The book of vows. It held more than names. It recorded the agreements sealed by blood and honor. When your family came to America, the book was lost. But the names Russo and Moretti stayed linked for many years, at least in the memory of those who survived." "So, that means I'm not an outsider? I didn't force my way into something I shouldn't have touched?" Nico stepped closer until the distance between us was nothing more than the length of a shared breath. "You didn't force your way in," he said quietly. "You came home." My mouth went dry. His words stitched together pieces of me that had always felt loose and scattered the loss of my parents. The grandmother who told stories like fairy tales, yet refused to explain how she knew things no one else in the neighborhood understood. The dishes she cooked, the nights she woke me to write down the names of strangers she dreamed about. All of it had seemed strange, even unhinged, when I was a child. But now, piece by piece, everything was aligning. Nico looked at me with a voice softer still, a whisper shaped only for me. "You are not alone, Emily. You didn't just save me. You reawakened a thread that has been buried in dust for decades. And now they know." I swallowed hard, my heart beat heavy, not from fear, but from the startling realization that for the first time in my life, I had roots, dark ones perhaps, buried deep in soil where light rarely reached, but real roots nonetheless, and I belonged to something no one could take away. Nico turned back to the photograph, touching the frame once more as if bidding farewell to someone from long ago. When he faced me again, his eyes no longer held their earlier chill. They held something quieter, a kind of silent respect, a recognition, a beginning. I didn't know where the future would lead, but in that moment, in my small apartment still echoing with signs of danger, I knew I was no longer the same Emily Russo. And Nico Moretti was no longer a distant name from a shadowed world. Together, we had unlocked a door sealed for 3 generations, and there was no way back. I poured 2 cups of hot tea, my hands still trembling lightly, my fingers gripping the handle as if anchoring myself against an evening thick with stories no one had ever told me. Nico sat across from me at the small kitchen table, the ceiling light softening the edges of his face, making him look less carved from steel than I had imagined a man who led the Moretti family to be. He accepted the cup with both hands, as though he had held many cups like this before. The scent of mint drifted through the air, and for the first time I realized there was a man sitting in my kitchen not by accident, but because of a connection that ran through blood. "Your grandmother, Maria, protected things no one else dared to hold," he said after a long silence. "She didn't just keep the ledger. She was the only one who opposed the split between the Russo and Moretti families after Lucia vanished. I looked up, the name striking something inside me like a soft, mournful note. Lucia. Nico nodded, his gaze reaching into a memory that didn't belong to the present. Lucia was my grandfather's sister. She loved a man from your family line, but their love was forbidden. When they planned to run away together, both disappeared on a stormy night. My family blamed yours. Your family accused mine. Two names that once stood side by side became branches that never met again. And Maria? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She was the only one who believed Lucia didn't vanish for love, he said. She believed someone in the shadows orchestrated it, but no one listened. She took the ledger and left. She never returned. I remembered the night before my grandmother died, her fading eyes, her trembling hand gripping my wrist, her voice breaking as she told me never to forget Lucia's name. She said that if someone ever spoke it to me with real sorrow, I could trust them. I hadn't understood. Now I did. I never forgot, Nico said quietly. He placed his hand on the table, palm open, not touching me but near enough for me to see the faint scar along his thumb. I once thought it was from a knife, but now it looked older, like it belonged to some ancient ritual. I grew up with stories about honor, loyalty, and the price of betrayal, but my father taught me something else. Power alone can't protect you. You need something more than that. You need trust. He paused, his eyes on mine, asking for something even he didn't seem certain he deserved. I didn't know why I trusted him, didn't know why. Out of all the expressions I had read on countless customers, his gaze made me feel steady. But perhaps it was because he spoke Lucia's name with real reverence, as though she weren't a forgotten ghost, but a crack he still carried in his heart. He looked at me for a long time, then spoke in a voice that seemed to hush the room around us. I don't know who has turned their eyes toward you, but if they know who you are, they will not stop. And if you still believe you can survive this alone, I won't stand in your way. But if you need it, I will protect you not because you saved my life, but because your blood once stepped in front of bullets for mine. I didn't ask why he was so certain. I simply looked at him, no longer guarded. And for a moment, in that small kitchen washed in the color of time, I saw my grandmother sitting in the corner, smiling softly like steam rising from tea, then fading as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. I didn't nod, but I didn't refuse. And perhaps, for people like us, that alone was enough to begin a promise. After that night, Nico did not drift out of my life like a passing wind that brushes by and disappears. Instead, he became a quiet presence, like the street lamp outside my window each evening, never bright enough to overwhelm, but always there, always unmistakable. He didn't come every day, never announced his visits, and never asked if I was free. He simply appeared at moments I least expected, bringing hot coffee on early mornings just as I opened the door for work, or leaving a cannoli wrapped in white paper on my windowsill as if someone knew I would need something sweet to begin the day. Once, after a late shift when rain poured hard over the Bronx, I stepped out the back door of Vincenzo's and found a black umbrella already open above my head, his familiar hand holding it without a word. We walked 5 blocks in silence, rain splashing against the sidewalk, the yellow streetlights reflecting off puddles like shards of broken mirrors. Neither of us spoke, yet his presence wrapped around me in a strange kind of safety, as though in the chaos of the world I had found a small, quiet place that belonged only to me. Still, Nico never crossed any boundaries. He didn't touch me unless I initiated it. He never stepped inside unless I invited him. He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. He simply sat on the stoop with an espresso in hand, eyes on the street, sharing small pieces of his past stories about his grandfather in Napoli, the first time he learned how to stay calm in a negotiation, or the way he remembered the scent of half-burned cigarettes on his father's fingers whenever the seasons changed. Those fragments weren't meant to impress or instruct. They felt like the way someone reveals himself little by little, hoping the other person stays long enough to hear the end of the story. And I, slowly, began to share too. About my days at Lehman College when I felt lost among students a few years younger. About the time I juggled 3 jobs just to afford this aging apartment. About the afternoons I spent with my grandmother Maria kneading dough in our small kitchen, sunlight pouring through the narrow window like a faded memory of sweetness. We never called these encounters dates, never labeled whatever was forming between us. But I knew my heartbeat shifted each time I heard that familiar knock late at night, or when a short message lit up my phone asking if I had eaten. I no longer felt lost in my old world. Yet I couldn't deny that Nico's world was a place I had never dared step into. Still, between those two worlds, we met in my kitchen, on the old stoop, beneath quiet November rains in the Bronx. The bond between us wasn't loud or rushed or sealed with dramatic promises. It was simple. 2 people who had lived very different lives finding each other at the exact moment they needed someone most. And though neither of us said it out loud, I knew that every lingering glance, every silence without awkwardness, every brush of a sleeve when handing over a cup of tea, all of it was telling a story words didn't need to touch yet. A story growing each day, quietly but deeply, like roots digging into the earth long before any flower breaks through. That night, the cold came earlier than usual, the late November wind carrying the sharp bite of the approaching winter. I had just finished washing the dishes when the knock came 3 familiar taps. I didn't need the peephole to know it was him. Nico stood there holding 2 cups of hot cocoa, steam curling upward, his thick coat softening his features, dulling that usual sharpness. I let him in without a word. The small kitchen warmed instantly with the scent of cocoa and the nearness of him. We sat at the wooden chairs by the table, hands around our cups, saying nothing for a long stretch of time. He looked into the cocoa, then turned to me, his voice low and softer than usual. "Today is Lucia's birthday." I froze, not from surprise, but from the quiet ache carried in his words. "No one mentions her anymore in my family," he said, but I never forgot. My grandmother once kept a tiny photograph so worn the face was blurred I always suspected it was Lucia. Nico nodded, his gaze drifting far. "She had eyes like yours, deep, direct, and honestly sad." I pressed my lips together, touching the warm rim of the cup to steady whatever trembled inside my chest. When he looked at me again, his eyes were no longer as cold as they had been. "Emily, I don't know what's coming. I can't promise it will be safe. But if I could choose again, I would still walk into that restaurant, still let you see me, and still stand at this door." His words settled inside me slowly, like wine sinking through cloth not sweet, but true. He wasn't embellishing, wasn't promising the impossible. He was speaking emotion with a kind of honesty rare in both his world and mine. And I, for the first time, no longer held my walls intact. "I once thought if a man like you walked into my life it would mean trouble," I whispered. "But now I know the scarier thing would be if you walked out and never returned." My lips trembled, not from the cold. Nico watched me for a long time as though reading each line of my face, every shift of my eyes. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't ask permission. He simply leaned toward me slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. I lifted my face, and my lips met his like a wordless confession. Our first kiss wasn't fierce or rushed. It was built from the long silence between us, from the glances we hadn't dared prolong, from the gentle brush of a shoulder in passing or the quiet nod when words failed. That kiss carried memories, losses, and truths that couldn't yet be spoken. He kissed me as though he had waited for that moment for a long time, and I kissed him as if I had always been meant to arrive here. When we finally drew apart, my lips trembled softly, my cheeks warm. He didn't speak. He simply touched my cheek, his fingers warm against my skin like a silent vow. I rested my forehead on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, I felt held by someone with no conditions attached. Inside me, every barrier collapsed. And I knew, from that moment on, we were no longer two people standing on opposite ends of the world. We had taken a step toward each other, and there was no path back. I do not remember exactly when I was taken, only that the Bronx was so cold that morning I had to wrap an extra layer of scarf around my neck before stepping out the door. Everything felt familiar, as always. The honking cars, the smell of toasted bread from the corner bakery, the hurried footsteps of people rushing to work. I did not see any strange car, no obvious sign, only a light touch on my shoulder as I crossed an empty alley, and then darkness swept over me as fast as a cold wind slipping down the back of my neck. When I woke, I was lying on an old metal chair, my wrists tied to the armrests, my feet numb against bare concrete. The room had no windows, only a small bulb dangling above me, its pale yellow light making everything feel as if it were floating in fog. There was no sound except water dripping in a steady rhythm somewhere behind the wall. I had no sense of how much time passed, an hour, 2, or an entire day, only the ache in my stomach, the dry burn in my throat, and the stabbing pain in my back, as though I had been sitting there for centuries. No one hit me, no one questioned me, but the silence itself was a cruel kind of torture. They left me alone with my fear, with the spiraling possibilities rising in my mind, each one worse than the last, each one too terrifying for me to picture clearly. When the door finally opened, the light from outside made my eyes sting. A man stepped in. He was not tall, not muscular, yet the way he carried himself made me feel small. He did not give his name, did not ask mine. He simply placed a phone on the small table in front of me, dialed a number, then held it to my ear. The ringing echoed once, twice. I was almost crying with the need to hear that voice. And then he answered. His voice came through, deep and steady but drawn tight like a wire. Emily? He repeated my name as if reassuring himself that I was still alive. I had no time to respond before the man took the phone and spoke, his voice turning soft in a way that made my skin crawl. If you want her alive, you know what to do, Moretti. Silence followed. I could not hear Nico's reply, only the faint, low growl caught in his throat before the call ended. The man placed the phone back on the table and looked at me. His eyes held no anger, no hatred, just an ancient kind of coldness, as if he were born without the ability to feel. Then he walked out, the door closing behind him. Once again there was darkness and the dripping water. I did not know who he was, did not know what was happening out there. But one thing was clear. This was not a simple kidnapping for ransom. This was a warning. This was how they wanted to hurt him without firing a single bullet. I thought of Nico, of his eyes the night we shared our first kiss, of the way he touched my cheek, as though I were something fragile to protect. And now, I was his weakness. They knew it. I knew it. And perhaps he had already anticipated it. I did not cry. I did not allow myself to. If he came for me, I had to survive until he arrived. If he did not, I would die, never knowing what might have become of the love that had barely begun. In that freezing room, I closed my eyes and imagined his familiar footsteps echoing down the hall. And I swore to myself, if I lived to leave this place, I would never walk away from that man again, no matter what waited ahead. The first sound I heard was not gunfire but footsteps heavy, urgent, pounding down the concrete corridor like the drumbeat warning of a coming storm. I opened my eyes. The dim bulb flickered overhead as if trembling with me. The metal door shuddered once under a powerful impact, then went still, as though someone had been testing its strength. For a moment, I did not know whether the person outside had come to save me or to end everything. A sharp explosion rang out, not a gunshot, but the scream of metal joints snapping. The door burst inward, fragments of rust scattering in the murky light, and the man who filled the doorway was Nico, not the impeccably dressed Mafia heir I had met, but a warrior, a storm-given human form, clad in a blood and dust-stained shirt, his eyes blazing with the silent fury of a man pushed well past his limit. He entered without a word, without hesitation, the Glock in his hand lowered but ready, lethal with the slightest provocation. I gasped, not from fear, but because for the first time I saw him exactly as the stories my grandmother Maria used to whisper the true Moretti, unyielding, unstoppable, a man who would never let anyone touch what he considered his. Two strangers followed him inside, moving with the practiced coordination of men who had done this their entire lives. Gunfire cracked in the hallway to the left, short, efficient bursts. A scream, then silence. Nico did not look at me immediately. He strode toward me, cutting the rope around my wrists with a small blade from his belt. As his fingers brushed my skin, I saw the scars etched along his knuckles, old, new, layered atop one another, yet his touch was impossibly gentle. He lifted his gaze to mine, and the eyes that met me were not the eyes of the man I had kissed in my kitchen. They were the eyes of someone standing at the edge of something raw and unbearable, where fear and love blur until they are indistinguishable. "Are you hurt?" His voice rasped, unsteady, as though he were barely holding back something more violent than gunfire. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. "I'm not hurt." He placed his hand on my cheek, the same soft touch as before, but now it carried something more confirmation that I was here, breathing, alive. Another volley of gunfire rang out, running footsteps, shouting. But inside that small room, there was only us. Nico lowered his forehead to mine, his whisper carving itself deeper than any oath ever signed in ink. "I swear I will never leave you alone again." I closed my eyes and let the tears fall, unrestrained, because I no longer had to be strong. I had been found. I had been held. Nico pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly it was as if he needed to prove to himself that I was real, flesh and blood, not a phantom torn away by the shadows outside. He turned, guiding me toward the exit without letting go of my hand. We walked out of that room, down the cold concrete corridor, past the chaos, the blood, the broken breath of dying men, and into the Bronx night where the smell of gunpowder still clung to the air. But in the midst of ruin and the stench of death, I felt reborn. And the man holding my hand was the only reason that was true. No explanations, no plans for tomorrow. Only one truth existed then. He had come. He had saved me. And he would never let the darkness claim me again. We left the Bronx early the next morning before dawn fully broke, mist settling like a veil over the remnants of the night. Nico brought me to a small house deep in the outskirts, surrounded by woods and birdsong. No phones, no signal, no one to know where we were. And for the first time in days, I slept without nightmares in the circle of his arms, warm and solid like a wall shielding me from the world. The days that followed felt like a slow dream. Nico did not speak much, but every gesture carried a quiet devotion that sank to the bone. He cooked, cleaned, brewed tea, and always looked into my eyes before touching me, as if every moment needed permission, as if every breath deserved respect. I never imagined love could be born from silence, Yet in that silence I heard more than any romantic vow could ever express. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the pines, Nico led me behind the house to a small patch of grass facing the lake. The water lay still as glass, catching the lavender hues of dusk, and the silence was deep enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. He told me to close my eyes. When I opened them, he was kneeling in front of me, not with a velvet box or flowers or glittering lights, but with a thin silver ring resting in his open palm, glowing softly like his voice when he spoke. He did not say, "I love you," like in the movies. He said that from the moment I traced those words on my palm, his world had shifted. I was the one thing he could not control and the only thing he never wanted to. He wanted me beside him, not as a woman standing behind him, but as the one person he trusted to stand at his side. Be my wife, Emily. For a few seconds I could not speak. The tears did not fall but gathered at the edges of my eyes, tightening my throat. I looked at him, the man who had once made an entire city tremble, now kneeling with no power in his eyes. Only the humility of someone who understood that love was the one thing no reputation could secure. I reached out, not for the ring's shine, but for the vow in his gaze. I say yes. Only those two words, yet it felt as though the universe held its breath to hear them. He rose, slipping the ring onto my finger with hands that trembled just slightly. The first time I saw fear in him, the fear of losing something he had only just allowed himself to name. I held him for a long time, feeling our heartbeats merge, as if every beat from this moment on would no longer be lived alone. In a world of shadows where power and betrayal walked side by side, the love between us was the only thing that remained pure. No witnesses, no wedding. Only the presence of each other in a quiet twilight, in a world where promises were often broken. Yet we chose to keep this one with the rest of our lives. And I knew, from that moment forward, I was no longer the quiet woman standing behind a diner counter, but a piece of the Moretti blood, something no one could ever tear away. Arthur Avenue on a bright Sunday morning in early May glowed beneath the first light of day. The heart of the Bronx's Italian district was draped in the red, white, green flags strung between balconies, bougainvillea petals drifting from second-floor windows, and church bells chiming softly through air filled with the scent of toasted bread, oregano, and freshly roasted coffee. The entire neighborhood seemed to pause for a moment no one dared call ordinary. Because in a world where shadows and honor move side by side, a wedding is never merely the union of two people, but a reaffirmation of legacy, of old promises once written in blood and now tied again with the heart. I stood before the mirror in the small room behind the San Gennaro church, the ivory wedding dress hugging my slender figure, its hand-stitched vintage lace sewn by women in the community who had known Maria. Women who believed the name Russo was not just a family, but a chapter of an era long gone. My hair was pinned in a soft bun adorned with jasmine blossoms, the flowers my grandmother once said symbolized unwavering loyalty. On my wrist, Nico had placed a small, worn silver bracelet earlier that morning, telling me it belonged to Lucia, found in an abandoned cellar in Naples, as though a fragment of the past had finally surfaced at the moment we needed it most. When I stepped through the heavy wooden doors into the sanctuary, the air seemed to fall silent for an instant. Colored light streamed from stained glass windows and spilled across the stone floor in fractured hues, as if time itself were offering its blessing. Nico stood at the end of the aisle in a classic black tuxedo with a white tie, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes remained the same as the night he knelt by the lake. There was no triumphant music, no fireworks, only the soft mandolin melody drifting from the church corner, the old tune Maria used to hum whenever she baked. I walked toward him one step at a time, looking at no one else, only at the man who made me believe in the impossible. The ceremony was performed by an elderly priest who had once married our parents' generation, his voice trembling as he read the vows as though each word had been written by destiny itself. When Nico slid the ring onto my finger, light brushed across the gleaming metal, and I felt the faint tremor in his breath. "You are the place I return to, the one thing I no longer need to hide from," he whispered. And I cried not from sentiment alone, but because I knew that from this moment forward, I would never be alone again. After the ceremony, we stepped out of the church beneath a shower of petals tossed from balconies. The applause, the cheers, even the playful whistles from the silver-haired Italian men seated outside the old cafe Nico once told me was where his father courted his mother. The reception was not held in a grand hotel but right in the square of the neighborhood. Long wooden tables lined up beneath strings of lights, white cloths printed with red motifs, the whole scene glowing like a summer festival from decades past. There was accordion music, pastries, cannoli, red wine poured endlessly from old glass jugs, and laughter rising as though the war between our families had never existed. I danced the first dance with Nico as our neighbors clapped along, people who had watched us walk through fire and blood to reach this day. When night settled, beneath twinkling lights and the aroma of food drifting through the air, I rested my head on my husband's shoulder, hearing the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The wedding was not merely an ending, it was a beginning, a symbol of what remains once the past is forgiven, and proof that love can survive even the shadows, so long as two people dare to walk toward the light together. The sign for Russo's Bakery hung quietly on a small street just off the main avenue in the Bronx, its vintage brown lettering curving across a cream background like a reminder of time and tradition. The wooden glass door had been repainted, but the brass handle remained tarnished, a detail I intentionally preserved from Maria's old bakery as a bridge between the past and the present. The scent of pastry dough, vanilla, and freshly roasted coffee drifted down the sidewalk each morning, drawing familiar footsteps from neighbors who had once watched me grow up behind the bar at Vincenzo's, and now returned to speak my name with a tenderness that felt like they had been waiting for this moment all along. The bakery windows were always polished spotless, and the glass display case was filled with fruit tarts, biscotti, zeppole, and cannoli made exactly from the old handwritten recipes in my grandmother's leather notebook. Each morning before the sun fully rose, I prepared the first batch myself while old songs played softly and warmth from the oven fogged the windows. Some days I saw Nico standing outside, not entering, just watching from the street in his dark coat, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile on his lips as though seeing me bathed in that golden light was all he needed to know we were on the right path. He never interfered with how I ran the bakery. No guards at the door, no trace of the underworld. Russo's belonged to me alone, a place where I set every price, chose every pastry, and picked every song. But I also knew that each night when I turned off the lights and locked the door, at least one of his men stood quietly on a nearby corner, and I never again feared walking home alone. Nico told me he did not need to stand inside to support me. He only needed the bakery to exist as proof that not everything born of darkness must remain there. Once, he brought me a small painting of the Naples marketplace from before the war, the place Lucia once walked. He set it by the register without explanation and left. I hung it opposite the photograph of Maria kneading dough in her old kitchen, two women from two eras, two worlds, now sharing the same space and watching over me as I wrote a new chapter. Children from the neighborhood often pressed their noses against the display glass, asking for a bite of something sweet. I always kept a small tray ready, knowing that perhaps their tiny hands would one day carry this story forward, not through guns or power, but through flavor and memory. One morning, While I was wiping down the counter, an elderly man stepped inside, resting his hand on the polished surface and looking around slowly. His gaze lingered on each framed photo before he nodded with quiet approval. He said the smell of the bakery reminded him of his mother, who had lived nearby when he was a boy. Before leaving, he turned back and said something that nearly brought me to tears. "Not everyone can turn a bakery into a place that heals." I did not answer. I simply smiled and returned to the ovens to prepare a new batch. Each day passed in a slow, meaningful rhythm, every pastry not just a product of skill, but the embodiment of a life that had survived storms and endured because of a belief in gentler things. And though he never said it outright, I knew Nico saw Russo's the same way he saw me on our wedding day. As a beginning, as a part of his life, he once believed he could never reach. But now, it lay before him every day. And it belonged to both of us. I discovered I was pregnant on a December morning when the Bronx lay wrapped in a cold so sharp that frost clung to the bakery windows like lace. The scent of cinnamon wafers and flour still hovered in the air, everything unfolding as usual until a brief wave of dizziness washed over me, forcing me to steady myself against the glass counter. It was nothing serious, but something inside me had shifted, a strange, tender warmth spreading through my chest as though I was no longer alone within my own body. I kept the secret for a few days, not out of fear, but because I needed to be certain it wasn't just a fleeting sensation. When the doctor confirmed it, I walked out of the clinic clutching the small ultrasound print, my heartbeat slow and steady like a melody I had never heard before in my life. I did not call Nico right away. I went home, cooked dinner, set the table as always, placed a tiny vase of jasmine on it, and lit a candle. When he walked in, I saw the familiar way his gaze swept across the room, as though searching for a sign that something was wrong. But he didn't ask. He simply shrugged off his coat, hung it up, and wrapped his arms around me from behind the way he always did. "I have something to show you," I said, laying the ultrasound image on the table, the candlelight shimmering faintly across its glossy surface. He bent over it, curiosity flickering briefly in his eyes before his shoulders stopped moving, as though his entire body had slowed down just enough to absorb what he was seeing. "That's our baby's heartbeat," I whispered. And in that instant, the eyes of the man I loved softened into a color I had never seen in him before. Nico, who had never once trembled even in the face of danger, now stood frozen in front of a blurry image on a small piece of paper, his palms pressed against the table as if steadying a world that had suddenly tilted. He did not cry aloud, but I saw the tear that slipped down, sliding slowly over his cheek and disappearing along the line of his jaw. He pulled me into his arms and held me so tightly I could hear his heart pounding, ragged, strong, and vulnerable all at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, as though it had traveled a long road just to reach this moment. "It's a girl," he said, with a certainty I couldn't bring myself to dispute. "A girl. What do you want to name her?" I rested my head on his shoulder, my fingers brushing the sleeve of the shirt he had not yet removed. "I was thinking, Maria Lucia." Nico didn't respond aloud, but his grip tightened, his hand trembling as it slid to rest over my belly, touching it as though it were the most sacred place he had ever known. "Maria for my grandmother, Lucia for the woman forgotten by history." And the child inside me would be the bridge between two generations, two fates, two shadows of the same bloodline. That night, we did not eat dinner. We sat together for a long time on the bench outside the balcony, where snow fell in thin, quiet layers over the old wooden boards. His hand remained on my belly as though that alone could protect, promise, and transform. In that moment, I was no longer the woman once tied down in darkness. And he was no longer the man shaped solely by a world ruled by blood and law. We were simply two people touching each other through the most fragile thing in the world, a new life. A hope, without a name, but now it had one. Maria Lucia. And she would grow up surrounded by the scent of baked pastries, laughter, and the stories we had once been afraid to believe were real until life itself left us no choice. News arrived on a spring morning when the Bronx had just begun to wake from weeks of cold rain, sunlight pouring through the bakery windows as I kneaded dough for the morning batch of cannoli. The first sound was not the bell on the door, but the hurried footsteps and ragged breaths of Mateo, one of Nico's old loyal men who now worked at the coffee roastery behind the market. His face was pale, his eyes frantic. "Something happened, Emily. It's Nico." I dropped the metal spoon in my hand, the clang slicing through the room like an alarm. In less than 10 minutes I was at St. Barnabas Hospital, where Nico lay unconscious in surgery. Blood still smeared across the leather jacket the nurse handed me, a violent testament to the nightmare I had always feared more than anything else. He had been shot 3 times. One round through the ribs, one grazing his neck, and one lodged just above his left shoulder. The attack took place in the parking lot behind St. Francis Church. Nico was too careful to have a routine. He had switched cars, changed his route, and gone 3 days earlier than planned, specifically to avoid being tracked while visiting his father's grave. But they were waiting. That was the terrifying part, not the ambush itself, but the realization that someone knew exactly where he would be even when he tried to disappear. No warning, no sign, no witnesses who could identify the shooter. But I knew this was no random act. It was a message. A reminder that in the world we lived in, the past never truly slept. I did not cry during the long hours outside the operating room. I sat there gripping the newest ultrasound image of Maria Lucia, my heartbeat dry and heavy, my eyes fixed on the closed door as though sheer will could keep him alive. When the doctor finally emerged, I barely heard words like stable, monitoring, needs time. Only one thing reached me. He was still alive. But I knew that wasn't enough. Mere survival would never be enough. The next morning, I stood up, brushed off my long skirt, and summoned every man who had ever served under Nico delivery runners from the Italian market, the keeper of the artisanal wine shop in Brooklyn, the bookkeeper for the seafood restaurants in Queens. They looked at me as though they had never seen a woman stand in that position before, in the very room where men had lived and died under my husband's command. But when I spoke, no one dared interrupt. "I'm not here to replace Nico. I'm here to preserve what he built. None of you is allowed to react with violence until I know exactly who did this. If he falls again, it will be because we failed him." No one objected. Their eyes lost all doubt. What remained was recognition. During the days Nico lay unconscious, I ran every part of the operation, coordinating crews, contacting doctors, overseeing the bakery so nothing would collapse. I worked with the urgency of someone who knew one moment of carelessness could erase everything we had built. For the first time in my life, I sat in Nico's office and read every file he left behind, the papers I once avoided now becoming the map I needed to navigate his world. I realized that the secrets I thought he kept from me were not secrets at all. They were preparations, laid quietly for the worst possibility. He had not hidden anything from me. He had been protecting me, and now it was my turn to protect him. 3 days later, footage from an old shop camera on Grand Street revealed the blurred silhouette of the shooter, a familiar face from the Ferretti family, the lineage that had once sworn never to touch the Morettis after an old truce. But oaths in this world are more fragile than gun smoke. I did not seek revenge. I simply ordered every path he could walk in the city to be blocked. No violence, but no escape. Then I returned to the hospital, to the bedside of the man I loved, took his bandaged hand in mine, and whispered that he could rest now, because I was the one standing between him and the world. And as long as I remained on my feet, no one, no one would ever harm our family again. Early morning light filtered softly through the hospital curtains, casting pale streaks across the washed-out white walls as though time itself was trying to move gently enough not to disturb the man lying in the bed. I sat beside him, my hand wrapped around his, the same hand that had been icy and numb during those first nights after surgery, and was now slowly warming, his fingers tightening whenever I whispered his name again. Nico opened his eyes on a morning no one had expected, the gray-brown eyes that had once looked at me as if I were the only thing in existence now clouded with exhaustion, yet holding the same familiar spark. I was there, not having stepped away even for a moment, and when his gaze found mine, I didn't need any words to know he recognized me instantly. He couldn't speak at first, his voice nothing more than a rough breath, but his eyes asked everything. I nodded, my own eyes trembling but not crying. I told him I was fine, that the bakery still opened every morning, and that Maria Lucia kicked gently at dawn whenever she heard Grandmother Maria's music. He closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down to his temple. The first time I had ever seen a man who had just crossed the edge of death tremble as though he had just reclaimed an entire world. The days that followed were slow, deliberate steps of recovery. I sat by his bed reading the faded pages of his grandmother's old journal, the ink smudged by time yet still breathing with the memory of a past we had never truly forgotten. He listened without missing a word, sometimes smiling, sometimes closing his eyes as though reliving memories that were not entirely his but somehow belonged to him all the same. Each night, I guided his hand to my belly where Maria Lucia continued to remind us of her presence, her tiny kicks like soft knocks from the future, insisting that life was not only being protected, but was steadily growing despite the shadows that still lingered outside. One night, after the nurse left, and only the sound of the heart monitor and his quiet breathing filled the room, Nico turned to me, his eyes still and deep like a lake with no wind. "What did you do when I wasn't here?" he asked. I squeezed his hand and smiled faintly. I told him I had stepped into his place, kept everything in order, let nothing fall. The bakery still smelled of vanilla and warm dough, and no more blood had been shed. He looked at me for a long moment, then spoke as if reciting a vow anew. He said he could never promise he would not be hurt again, but he promised he would always come back. No matter what, he would always return to me. I leaned forward until our foreheads touched, our breaths mingling, and in that stillness it felt as though all the fear of the past months finally found its way out. We did not speak of revenge. We did not mention the name behind the trigger, because in that moment, the only thing that existed was us, the small family growing inside me, the home filled with the scent of baked bread and old Italian songs drifting from the radio. The mornings when he watched me walk into the kitchen and the nights when his arms were wide enough to hold the entire fragile world I carried. Nico survived not only because he was strong or the doctors were skilled. He survived because he had made a promise not to leave me alone. And this time, that promise was renewed without wedding rings or spilled blood, but with the gentle tightening of two hands belonging to people who had crossed the thin border between life and death, and still longed to build the days that had not yet come. 5 years passed like the blink of an eye, and the Bronx now looked nothing like the days when Nico and I first met in the cramped kitchen of Vincenzo's. Russo's bakery had expanded into the next storefront, becoming a 2-story space with a small coffee counter in front and a quiet reading area in the back, where the elders of the neighborhood gathered each morning with espresso and newspapers. Children still lined up every afternoon, not only for the crisp sweetness of the cannoli, but for the laughter that floated constantly in the air, as though every sad memory had been wrapped in powdered sugar and left behind. Maria Lucia was now 4, with curls the color of hazelnuts and her father's deep, watchful eyes. Eyes that observed the world with a quiet intelligence that often startled the adults around her. She loved standing behind the counter with me, sprinkling colorful toppings on cupcakes with a seriousness that made it seem as though she were running an entire universe made of sugar. Whenever anyone asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would answer in her soft but steady voice that she wanted to run the bakery like her mother, but she would add a small corner that sold strawberry ice cream because Daddy likes that flavor. Nico had changed profoundly since returning from the edge of death. No more late-night meetings, no more phone calls from untraceable numbers. He sold almost all the properties tied to his old world, keeping only a few legitimate businesses and shifting his focus to community investment. He founded a nonprofit called the Lucia Foundation, dedicated to helping Italian-American children in the Bronx learn traditional culinary skills. Instead of covert orders or smoky negotiations, his days now began with him reading finance books, taking our daughter to the park in the afternoons, and spending evenings with me under the warm glow spilling from the bakery windows. Some days I found him sitting quietly in the small office behind the shop, looking at an old photograph of his grandparents when they were young. He once told me that the past never disappears, but if we are brave enough, we can choose to turn it into the foundation for something better. I watched his face as he said that, the light brushing over features once carved by hard choices, and I knew the man who had once been a symbol of fear had chosen instead to become a symbol of hope. Though he never said it aloud, I understood that every clean choice he made was for Lucia, so she could grow up in a world without hidden darkness. Nico had once been the night, but now he chose to be his daughter's light. Our life was not glamorous or grand. It was simple, like the way I arranged pastries in the display case each morning, like the way Nico knelt to tie Lucia's shoes before the three of us walked to the park on weekends. Yet within that simplicity lay the deepest truth of love and redemption. And even though no one spoke anymore of those early days filled with blood and shadow, I knew it was precisely those days that had forged us into who we were now. In the family portrait hanging in the center of the bakery, where every customer could see it when they walked through the door, we stand together, Nico, Lucia, and I, hands clasped in front of the shop. No one looking at it could ever guess what we endured to reach that moment. But we remember. And that is why every pastry at Russo's tastes a little sweeter, because it is made not only of sugar, butter, and flour, but of survival and the rebirth of a life that once seemed to have no way out. It shows two women standing together in front of an old kitchen, one with dark, laughing eyes and the other with a shy smile that feels like a forgotten secret. They are my grandmother Maria and Nico's great-aunt Lucia, captured in the summer of 1939, just months before the storm that would separate our families for decades. No one knows who took that photograph, but to me, it is more than a preserved memory. It is a symbol of an eternal promise between generations of women who lived, loved, sacrificed, and stood strong in a world that never stopped shifting beneath their feet. Every morning before opening the bakery, I stand in silence for a moment before that picture. Not to pray, but to remind myself that everything I have was not handed to me by luck, but shaped by choice, the choice to forgive, to continue, to live differently. Grandmother Maria once taught me that some things never fade no matter how many seasons pass. The smell of morning bread, the laughter of children, and a love built on trust rather than power. And now I carry her teachings forward not through speeches, but through each warm loaf I place on the counter at dawn, through the way Lucia lifts her eyes to her great-grandmother's image with a quiet awe. Nico continues his work quietly. He no longer appears often in public, but his name is tied to community projects, to scholarship funds honoring those who are gone, to stories of redemption, change, and hope. I know he still carries the shadows that once ruled his life, but he has turned those shadows into the very ground on which the light now rises for his daughter. And each time I watch Lucia run around the bakery, chatting in bits of Italian picked up from the elderly neighbor next door, I feel as though I am watching a new chapter unfold, one that is clean, whole, and full of promise. Our story, at its heart, was never a story about the Mafia, about revenge, or the clashes that simmer beneath the surface. It is the story of people who chose to rise from places where hope once seemed impossible. The story of a woman who once served tables in a dim, narrow restaurant and dared to rewrite her life with love, with courage, and with a gentleness that refused to break. And now, we find ourselves at the final page of this journey. If you have stayed with us until this moment, thank you for walking with us through every upheaval, every breathless moment, every fragile step toward the light. How did this story make you feel? Did something in it touch you? Have you ever witnessed how a single word, a single quiet act in an ordinary moment, could change the course of a life? We would love to hear your honest reflections in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video if it moved you, inspired you, or simply offered you a moment of stillness in the rush of everyday life. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling stories filled with humanity and meaning. Thank you for spending your precious time with us today. Wishing you good health, a peaceful life, and a heart that never stops hoping. We will see you in the next video. Goodbye.